Okay, so it's 8:05, I think, and I'll see that we're already filling the room, and I think, yeah, honoring the time and our what is in front of us. Let's start today. This is our last seminar in a series of 6 seminars that have been amazing, and I would say incredibly, really interesting. And today we have Steve Vincent, who is quite active in critical realism. He's going to speak about having critical realism as a framework. And what I really like from Steve is your own experience using this, which makes you someone quite knowledgeable in this tricky aspect of critical realism as a framework. I leave Steve to introduce himself, what he does and where he works. I think he knows that better than I do. And I'm here hosting this wonderful event on the backstage. And I'll leave you then, Steve, to go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to come and speak to you guys today. Basically, I'm going to reflect on my own experience trying to use critical realism as a theoretical underlaborer to assimilate other forms of social theory, and in doing so, it's really using kind of critical realism as a framework for developing knowledge using existing theoretical resources. Get the technologies work for me. There we are. In terms of an overview of where we're going today. So the topic is using critical realism as a framework, and I asked myself the orientating question: how do the conceptual parts of critical realism combine to help us develop knowledge about the social world in particular? And then at the back end, the second half, I'm going to consider how I use critical realism in relation to a couple of the pieces of research I've done. To think about how it's done, the process. I'm basically I'm a professor of work and organisation, and I came to critical realism, as many of us, with my undergraduate thesis. My doctoral thesis, which looked at interorganisational relations and their implications for employment. And since then, I've sort of studied a range of employment issues. And a couple of my recent projects, one has been an edited collection on the political economy of HRM, or human resource management. And so how the embeddedness of HRM, within a broader economic and regulatory structure has implications for practice. And then another project I did was I interviewed a load of HRM consultants within a sort of regional economy of the UK. And I asked them about how they networked, where they networked, why they networked where they did, and what resources they accessed from different organisations that they connected with through their networks, and how. What were the mechanisms that facilitated them doing that? And what I found, in that piece of research, I didn't intend to stumble across Bourdieu. I understood that he was important for understanding networks and social capital and stuff like that, but I didn't intend to turn myself into a Bourdieusian. But as I started reading Bourdieu within the context of sort of a critical realist background, I come to found a lot of his concepts and how he viewed the world as being useful for extending realist social theory. So that's basically where we're going. I'll start by saying something generally about critical realism, which might be a bit repetitive by now for you, I'm sure, but I think we need to go over that ground again, perhaps, and then I'll look more at a few aspects of my own research and how I've used critical realism as an anchor and an underlaborer, really, to study aspects of the social world. Okay, so critical realism is a framework. By now, I imagine you are getting bored of these concepts. But nonetheless, we always start with them. We're realists, right? We start with ontology. It's what we do. When we have the domain of the empirical, the stuff we observe, sensory experiences, the things that actually happen, that might not be readily observed, that are generated by causal structures and mechanisms. Then we have the domain of the real, which is the structures and mechanisms that generate events, that generate the actual. And this is the problem, really. How do we bridge the theoretical gap? Because on the one hand, there's what we see, and on the other hand, there's the explanation of what we see, which is about the generative fabric, the generative structure, whatever we might like to call it. And so we need theoretical work in order to explain the empirical. This is a phrase that I took from an article by Brannan et al., which me, Joe Mahoney, Matthew, and Steve Fleetwood wrote. But I attribute this phrase to Steve Fleetwood. We as realists, we need theoretically informed and empirically substantiated accounts of the social world. The empirical domain leads credence to our explanations, and our explanations are often necessarily theoretical, because the things that are real and explain the events that happen aren't necessarily immediately empirically observable in the present in order to be actual or effective. This idea of depth is very important here. And then the problem, is that when we peer into the textbooks about any given domain, we find a lot of theory, and we've got to try and make sense of it. But theory, I think, can be ordered and critiqued using critical realism. And this really is the bridge, if you like, to developing theoretical realism or critical realist approaches to specific domains of inquiry. Okay, so we've got the idea of ordering, and then we've got the idea of critique. I think these are two separate things. I'm going to start with the sense of the order of theory. So, what I've articulated so far is sort of part of what you might call the general realist ontological meta theory. The ontological commitments of theoretical critical realism, the idea that there's an external universe, the notion of the laminated system, a hierarchy of entities that interact across different domains or levels of reality. So it's hierarchized, if you like, people within groups, within organizations, within cities, within countries. So there's a specific layering to the open system. Well, and it is an open system, that all the parts interact in real time in an unpredictable way, and things emerge. There's causal powers, and entities have causal powers, and causal powers interact to affect the emergence of events within the open system, which is laminated and external to us. Okay, fine, we've read that bit. And then we have general realist social theory again, which a lot of us have read. And so this is the implications of the realist ontology for a generalist approach to theorizing the social domain. There's a lot of work done, in particular by Margaret Archer, but many others, including Dave, who's still in the room. The transformational model of social activity, which comes from Bhaskar, but Archer's morphogenesis. We have various social theories' contribution to the concept of social structure, ideas of cultural conditioning and the reflexive subject, human agency, being specifically causal because it's an entity in itself. All of this stuff is sort of like consonant with critical realist ontological commitments, but it's applied within the social domain. And then below this, we have sort of like domain-specific meta-theories. And here, the task of the realist is to reread and assimilate other sort of grand theories, if you will. Here we might talk to Bourdieu's American institutionalism, structuration theory, the Frankfurt School, Foucauldian sociology, actor network theory. There's a range of different social theoretical resources that critical realists have looked at and said, well, okay, this is clearly useful in describing something, but perhaps its underlying ontology misses some of the fundamentals of a realist social theory, you know, and generalist realist ontology. And we need to rethink it and reshape it in order to make it compatible. So in a way, you know, realism is a bit of a hegemonic project in that regard. You know, it's trying to colonize other theory and reread it from the point of view of a version of the world that's consistent with critical realism. And then below this, again, you have sort of like what I'd call domain-specific theories that perhaps aren't informed as much by sort of like, or that might be informed by the domain-specific meta-theories. You know, so Marxism, for example, is informed labour process theory, and labour process theory is about how organizations that are competing with a capitalist system sort of struggle to cede authority to workers, struggle to do away with hierarchy, that are constantly trying to revise themselves in order to actually extract more surplus value. You know, and so within a broadly Marxist framework, you then have a specific theory about how labour tends to be organised at the point of production. And you can point to other middle range theories, resource dependency theory, institutional discrimination as a couple that are there within organisation theory and employment studies broadly. These theories tend to connect the macro with the micro, but in a more specific way. They might describe a mechanism of the relations between entities that tends to produce a particular outcome, what Lawson might call a demi-regularity. So this is sort of like the general space we're dealing with here. You know, we have our general realist ontology, then we have realist social theory, then we have other theories that have yet to be assimilated, and the constituent elements draw upon those theories in the effort to explain the connections between the parts of the social fabric and how they combine to generate events. So we're moving there from the abstract, you know, the general conditions of the universe, to the specific, you know, what I'm studying here and how what I'm studying can be understood, you know, theoretically through the lens of a realist ontology and a realist social theory, and as well as domain-specific forms of grander theory. Okay, so yeah, that's where we're sort of like, that's what we're dealing with basically. So what does this suggest? Well, you know, I don't think realists chuck the baby out with the bathwater. You know, there's a lot of good work being done, some of which is already highly consonant with realism, precisely because, you know, people are working towards the truth. You know, they're not trying to tell lies about the world. You know, and so their commitments might not be exactly consonant with critical realism, but there's stuff we can learn from what other people write about the nature of social phenomena. You know, and because there are multiple causes in operation at any time, you know, because it's an open system, we don't know precisely which connections at what levels are going to be relevant to the particular event that we happen to be studying. So we need to be inclusive. We need to engage with theoretical pluralism. We need to be open-minded about the theory we use, and we need to engage in abduction, which is sometimes called retroduction, sometimes called retrodiction. I just call it abduction. You know, you might say that retroduction is operating closely within sort of like the theoretical lexicon of critical realism in order to explain something new in those terms, whereas retrodiction is more about explaining the world when we already know and have theorized what a set of mechanisms is, and so that's sort of a more traditional form of abduction, if you will. Abduction involves redescribing the world within a more standard template of concepts. You know, so basically abduction involves using the theory we have in order to generate new forms of knowledge about the world. You know, I think abduction is inevitable because we always bring conceptual baggage with us to interpret what we find. It's just that you know, some social researchers, I don't think you know, like to admit it as much, and but anyway, that's an aside. The effort, I think, is we hold a variety of conceptual schemas up against the world and see which ones fit in terms of building a theoretically formed and empirically substantiated explanation of the particular events we observe. It's sort of like, it's a game of, it's an experimental game in which we think about different conceptual resources and how they might help. Now, going back to my own journey to try and assimilate Bourdieu with realism, I started with social capital, which I thought is a concept that could be rewritten from the point of view of a realist ontology, precisely because there's different varieties of social capital. And I assumed that the variety that we used or observed would depend on the nature of the context within which it was applied. So I thought there was grounds for assuming that, but I then drifted off and thought, well, there are other resources as well, and these things also seem to be important. And then old Bourdieu seems to be useful at understanding these other resources. I'll come back to that, but you can see there that there's an iterative process that involves looking at the existing social lexicon of theoretical resources, or the lexicon of theoretical resources, to think about, well, what is going to work from the point of view of developing an explanation of the thing that I'm observing here and now. And realist social theory is there as an anchor for us. It helps. And what we're trying to do is assimilate theories and ideas in such a way as to produce a less worse or a more purposive or explanation of events, and the one that's consistent with ontological realism. In what follows, I'm going to have a very quick trot through some of the key concepts in realist social theory, because that's sort of like moving down a level from sort of like general realist ontology to realist social theory. This is my reading. This is the concepts that I've used or taken from realist social theory when trying to understand what a general social structure of the nature of the social domain is. And other people have different readings, and I guess you've got to find one that works for you. This is mine as of now. I'm not committed to it. I would have written something slightly different 2 weeks ago, probably. But this is the sort of thing that you tend to find people writing in this area. So we start with this idea of sort of like the laminated system of irreducible layers, and so the universe is constructed of a hierarchy of things, and I spoke about agents within teams within production units within factories within holding companies within supply chains, and so actually, when we think about what the social world is, it's a hierarchy of entities that constitutes a sort of laminated system. And I'd argue, and I think what we're all trying to do is we're not trying to bombard the world with lots of concepts. We're actually trying to work through to an efficient characterization of the causes of particular phenomena. And so we're trying to concentrate on the things that matter, I guess. And I tend to talk about social structures. I tend to talk about organizations and other meso-level social entities. I struggle with the concept mechanism, but I'm sort of happy that a concept of mechanism is a useful one. I find it a bit clunky. I use the term institution, and these are terms I basically borrow the reading of Steve Fleetwood and others. There are social cultural phenomena, which I take from Archer, and I take Archer's reading of agency in here as well. Although you might say it's at odds with Bourdieu, but that's a matter for debate, I guess. Okay, so social structures. There's the definition of Steve Fleetwood: a lattice work of internal relations between entities, agencies that may enable, constrain, but do not determine the plans and actions of agents who reproduce and transform these relations. So basically, social structures are a network. And this network affects what people do, but it doesn't make people do particular things. Perhaps slightly more sophisticated, but I like the idea of the social structure being a network. I think it is. So social structures are collective practices, acceptances, positions, rules, rights, obligations, and such likes that are emergent features of human actions and interactions and which relationally organize individuals as communities. That's relatively recent from Tony and Orson's new book, which has, I've read the first third of it. It's pretty good. So I commend that to you. But yeah, so there we have, I like this idea of position. Again, this is a concept I'll come back to, but it also chimes with this notion of network. But here we have other concepts like rules, rights, obligations, and such like that then have a conditioning, non-determinative effect on what people do and affect the emergence of other things like organizations or teams or whatever. They're a consequence of people in positions acting out rules, rights, obligations, and such like. So a class of phenomena. That leads us to culture, which I take to be the collective property register, which is contested, which contains cleavages, differences in opinions about the nature of stuff and what should and shouldn't be done, which sometimes we live with or sometimes they're resolved. I like Andrew Sayers' book in this area on the moral significance of class. Whilst it isn't strictly embedded within critical realism, Sayers very much a realist thinker, and he talks about how people in different class positions tend to collectively come to value their own position as a group and contrast their position with others' position. And beneath this is sort of like the human agent's desire for ontic security, that they actually want to feel valued within a community and that their position within wider society is of value, and that people tend to construct their cultural spectacles, if you will, from that point of view of the position and how collective property registers evolve as a consequence of the interactions of humans with different positions or agents with different positions. And then we have organizations, which I think they're a class of entity. They have boundaries, they have sovereignties within jurisdictions, they have roles and responsibilities, and they're often consciously designed. And so they're actually social entities that have a purpose. And that's important to understanding their essences. They have their own cultures and practices, and these cultures and practices govern relations. The form of the network that exists within the organization is governed by the cultures, practices, rules, and such like. Then the responsibilities that its members adhere to, if you will, and then organizations are things in themselves. They have rates of production, rates of innovation. They have levels of social capital internally. And these things, what they do is they tend to contain, transform, and transmute distinctive types of resources. Ultimately, describing the social world as a collection of resources is useful in this regard, because organizations are articulated as a consequence of how people, machines, money, ideas come together to enable a rate of production or a rate of innovation or something to happen. And then there are other meso-level social entities. I think norm circle, I think Dave discussed that a couple of weeks ago. You can talk to families, villages, towns, states, conglomerations, supply chains. There are lots of different ways to describe meso-level entities. And organization is just one of them. Then we get to mechanism. As I say, I'm not a massive fan of mechanism, because I find the language of mechanism inherently clunky. The way I describe it is how entities with causal powers come together to affect events. And they're easy to identify when they come together in a regular way. So it's a specific identifier relational of entities which are neither organization nor reducible to the power of any individual or individual social entity of a different form, but which cause specific emergence. They can be within organizations, they can be between, employment relations between managers and employees. are affected by particular rule systems. We can say that those entities come together under a particular set of rule systems to affect a mechanism which might determine, I don't know, the level of innovation, the rate of production, so on and so forth. Or they can be between organisations, contractual relations within supply chains as governed by national employment laws in relation to payment of debts or something like that. Or they can be without formal organisations, networks of individuals within societies that sort of get stuff done as a matter of norms relating to reciprocity. And these are middle level phenomena which can be known via middle range theory. I think that the example of institutional discrimination is a good one here. Organisations often don't set out to discriminate against the people who are their constituent members. But the rule systems, the values, how people tend to be selected, ends up with things like glass ceilings that mean that women struggle to get promoted, or sticky floors in which women struggle to get from the shop floor up to the next level. There's lots of reasons for these. The time in work being one factor that is often blamed, but there are lots of cultural reasons as well. So anyway, we've got the theoretical results there, the notion of middle range theory, that isn't specific to any organisation, that describes a class of mechanism in which specific groups will find themselves at a disadvantage owing to how entities come together conditionally in a particular circumstance. Institution, another term I use, basically I borrow this, we borrow this in a way from American institutionalism, although we add layers to our ontology in a way that institutionalists tend not to. But institutions at a micro level of customs, rules, norms, obligations, values. They can be codified and written down. They can be subconsciously held, enacted, hardwired, if you will, and then for not questioned. And these are constituent elements of culture. I don't think we can detach one from the other, and which are policed by norm circles, to bring Dave back in again. And so that sort of offers another layer, if you like, of how we can dissect the parts of society. This is an area Steve Fleetwood, I know, has been struggling for a while in terms of trying, because he's a really good taxonomist, and I know he's been trying to work out how to classify these parts. I don't think he likes the term institution, but anyway, that's an aside. Have a chat with him about that. I'm sure he'll be interested to tell you if you manage to catch up. And finally, agency, the specific causal power of an individual, or it can be a collection of practices that come together within an organisation. An organisation has agency. It involves reflexive capacity, and I'd argue incorporated habit. It involves choices, projects, and strategies. So it's what we do and our power to act. Okay, and that's a lot of whistle stop tour through what I think some of the key concepts within the critical realist, if you like, core lexicon are. Basically, it gives us something like that in terms of our hierarchy or laminated system. You've got transcendent socio-cultural structures, class, gender, ethnicity, international relations. There are these sort of like a high level abstractions, but then you have at the middle level organizations, mechanisms, institutions, and then at the very micro you have reflexive social agents who are struggling to make sense of it all and decide what to do and what's in their interests, and what they think a decent project is. Causation operates up and down, and I think that's an important point because that makes our lives a bit more complicated. And we, in our research, we therefore have to decide which way, what is a specific direction of causality that's explaining a particular emergence. So upwardly, agents reauthor the rules. They change what is normal in a given context. Then things emerge within mechanisms or within organizations as a consequence of changes to the institution. So recently the current government in the UK introduced new legislation in relation to human rights. That looks to be giving the government a lot more power to decide what our human rights are than the courts, and that's been described as a power grab, but that gives them the right to author what our rights are in relation to our practices. With the recent variant of COVID, the government has also acted to affect rules in relation to the use of masks and needing passes in order to get COVID passes in order to get into events. And so it changes the institutions, and that then affects the mechanisms and the emergence of organisations. Downwardly, you also have examples of transcendent changes affecting what is possible more locally. And here's where labour process theory can come back in again. Remember, labour process theory is about how relations between organisations within a competitive system have implications for the possibilities at the point of production. And an important point here is that actually competition for resources at an inter-organisational level has real implications for the resources available to invest in people, to invest in skills, to invest in their ability to add value and capture that value at the point of production. And so that's an example of downward causation. So causation within this system is going on in all directions. So we need concepts in order to understand, and we need local theories in order to understand how these general realist concepts actually come to be articulated or present, if you like, in the social world in particular domains. Okay, so the general question was how the parts of the CR Lexicon combine to enable us to develop knowledge about the social world. We have this commitment to depth, and that alone makes theoretical synthesis a vital part of the research process. And so we have to align our theoretical lenses to reveal unseen aspects of causal formations, if you will. And this results in the need to ask transcendental questions, by which we mean simply, what are the conditional possibilities of the things we observe happening and not otherwise? In general, we're seeking a better, a deeper, more useful, predictive explanation for the essential nature of the generative structure or the generative fabric, the things that explain and account for a given thing happening and why it happens as it does and not otherwise. And we're trying to develop an explanation that is both more adequate than previous explanations, so a better class of explanation, and also one that is compatible with critical realism and CR compatible. I've got to edit that bit, and compatible with critical realism. And as we've seen, I think realist social theory is in a state of development. Things are never fixed. But I think it is attempting to develop a more parsimonious body of concepts that's rooted in critical realist ontology, which then can be applied to a range of social settings. And I think that's where we're at with it. And so the problem then is to use this lexicon, both in terms of the general critical realist ontology and in the social domain with realist social theory as underlaid to our own studies. And then much depends on the thing that we're interested in, whether it's an entity, a discourse, a tribe, a policy. And so we have to then move from a set of abstractions to the thing that takes our interest. And this brings us on to leveraging the lexicon, actually using the lexicon in order to inform our own studies and our own view of the world. Okay, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to think about I'm going to start with the bottom level, basically, rereading domain-specific concepts using critical realism. And I'm going to use the domain of employment studies broadly as being the domain I will reread. And then I'm going to look at Bourdieu as a more general framework for understanding society. And I'm going to perform what I describe as an immanent critique of a grand theory. And so we're starting at the bottom of the 4 layers with the main specific theory, and then we're going to move up a layer and think, well, how does critical realism deal with the perhaps more challenging issue of dealing with some of the big social theories that are actually out there. Now, to do this anyway, I think you just have to immerse yourself in critical realism. My own journey with critical realism was a deliberate strategy. I got out of a master's in human resource management, and there was a research job at Manchester School of Management, and I got the job. And became a researcher, and it was agreed that I would do my research on the data that we were collecting for the project. But within the project, there was some, at the time, some what you might call world-class scholars, people like, I don't know, you probably haven't heard of them, but Hugh Wilmot, Mick Martinson, Jill Rubery, Damien Grimshaw. They're all sort of like leading lights within the field of HRM, organisation studies, employment relations, and they're all picking over the same data. And I found that, actually, one way I could make my project distinctive was to root it in critical realism. And as my research developed, I think I reverted in a little way, because I've got this really big sense of fairness. I like the world to be as fair as possible, and so I got into understanding the emergence of inequitable outcomes within economic systems and thinking about what can be done to ameliorate these. And I think in terms of my own journey, because I started with critical realism and tried to make my original PhD project distinctive by using critical realism, I think ever since then it's always been ever present in my mind when I think about and try to describe the world. So this is a relatively recent contribution. With colleagues, we edited a special issue of Human Resource Management Journal, which is an okay journal in the field of human resource management, and this is sort of like a set of ideas about what economic systems look like from the point of view of a realist social theory lexicon. I started to develop the idea well over a decade ago in a chapter I wrote with Paul Thompson, now retired, who was a scholar up at Strathclyde. But we wrote a chapter on labour process theory and critical realism, and we developed this idea of a laminated system for that. And I developed it further for this special issue. I doff my cap at this point towards Paul Edwards, who in 2005 wrote a piece that said actually a lot of employment studies, organisational and HRM research is already relatively compatible with critical realism, precisely because it views organisations within as real entities. It views relations between people as affected by their positions and the rules by which they operate. And so there was always an implicit realism, Edwards argued, within the field of employment relations and HRM and industrial relations. And this is sort of like this is the current state of play in relation to my thinking about how employment systems are hierarchized. I guess start from the top. You could do pick a point. And all points affect all points. Basically, is what I'm arguing here. We find ourselves within an economy that has a financial, regulatory, and governance system that affects The laws in relation to employment, it affects corporate laws in relation to supply chains, it affects the constitution of boards and how financial reporting actually happens. And so there's a system of rules above the corporation. And this varies incredibly between different nation states. So Germany is very different from the UK, is very different from Japan. Beneath that, you have sort of like inter-organizational relations, you have supply chains, and these are global. We have global value chains now, where you sort of like have sweatshops workers in Bangladesh being paid tuppence, but marketing managers in the States earning mega bucks, but they're all in effectively the same organizational system. And beneath that, you then have employing organizations, entities that actually engage in contracts of employment with people, over time in order to purchase labor. And that within these organizations, you have employment relations, which are the relations between managers and employees of different kinds, as well as relations between employees of different kinds who take their own positions in relation to how the resources of the organization should be redistributed. These condition, as we saw, the cultural knowledge system, because people in employment relations system have different positions and they come to value their own positions and value investments in their own positions and contest those investments with other groups of workers and with the organization in general. And foundationally, and very much in line with Marx, this whole system is pinned on natural and abstract resources. On the one hand, you have commodities, orange juice or water or coffee, looking at the things in front of me now. But they're also abstract, they take on a money form. They come to be valued in different ways in cultural knowledge systems. And so actually, the value of resources becomes abstracted and realized at higher levels of this laminated system. And what this is just a realist rereading of what we already know. You can see within it, there's a sort of like the hierarchized order, and there is an open system of relations. And these things, we argue, will combine and interact in a ways that affects the practical agency of the HR practitioner. So the practical agency of the HR practitioner operating in USA is very different from the practical agency of the HR practitioner operating in Germany, precisely because the regulatory systems are different, for example. And so you can get that specific point of comparison and try and work through how broader governance systems affect the practical agency of HR managers. So you can sort of like use this as a yardstick for identifying how aspects of the employment system combine to affect, enable, catalyze, obviate, or any other words we tend to use in relation to describing how structure impinges on agency, what HR managers actually do. So it's a sum of what's possible. That's not saying it's all specifically causal at any one time. And so when we are interested in particular events, we need to reflect on how these things combine in specific ways, in particular settings. And what we argue is basically that this is or offers a more complete picture of the specific domain of study. Okay, finally, he says, looking at the clock with one eye, this brings us to the critique of Bourdieu, or the critique of a grander theory from the point of view of critical realism. Immanent critique is the criticism of a philosophy using its own standpoint. So you're basically inspecting from an internal point of view what's good about it and what it helps with, and perhaps what it seems to be less good at, given everything else we know. And this given everything else we know bit is important because we as realists come to the world with a particular point of view of what the world is and how it operates. And so actually the realist lexicon, both in its abstract form as an ontology and its more concrete form as a social science, actually enables immanent critique by contrasting one standpoint against another. So social theory can be used to consider what theories add in terms of understanding of the generative structures that affect events, you know, and it also can be used to identify omissions and synthesize additions from the point of view of what a realist social theory believes and brings. I give this example in the reading. I enjoyed reading it. I'm not going to talk about it much now, but I selected that reading because it was relatively straightforward in terms of demonstrating what an empirical critique, an immanent critique is. You know, the idea of realist evaluation, you know, which is really, you know, used with a great deal of gusto within policy research. You know, is evaluated from the point of view of critical realism and developed from the point of view of critical realism in order to construct something that seems to be more in keeping with the realist lexicon. And that's very much what immanent critique is all about. So that's an accessible example for you, which I'm not going to talk about now. But I'm going to talk about this paper, which I wrote with Vicky Pagan, in which we actually we don't call it an immanent critique, but we do offer an immanent critique of Bourdieu using a realist social theory lexicon. Bourdieu's great. Let's start by saying that. If you want to do an immanent critique of Bourdieu, go out and look at how many times he's been cited. He's the most cited social science, or very close to the most cited social science. And I think it's because he reduces a social world and understanding the social world into a limited range of concepts. It's highly parsimonious. Yeah, it's quite stringent in terms of delimiting the concepts we need to get a handle on what's going on. This is it, you know, Bourdieu in 4 bullet points. The macro, what we call social structure, he calls the field of power, the field of resources. And at a micro level, we can consider how people are positioned in the field of power, the field of resources. Going back to employment relations between managers and employees. Managers are located in an advantageous position in the field of power. They have more access to resources in that people below them must do what they say, whereas people positioned as workers are really there to do what they're told to a greater extent, particularly in the UK, where the law is based on you know, master and servant acts that existed 100 years ago. But anyway, this is an aside, but you can see there that position within the field matters from the point of view of your ability to act. The middle levels, sort of meso level in Bourdieu, it's made up of basically 2 concepts: forms of capital. He talks about economic capital, so money, social capital, connections, cultural capital, which is a mixture of things. It's information, it's knowing what to do, how to do it. It's also institutionalized within cultural systems. It's also artifactual. You know, so artwork is a commodity, you know, that is readily commoditized. And then finally, symbolic capital, that's prestige. It's been seen to have credibility within a given domain, because that then gives you access to favors in relation to social capital, which means you're more likely to be able to access economic capital and cultural capital. And what Bourdieu argues is that forms of capital make fields distinct. You know, so the domain of education, you know, we value new research, we value high status outputs, we value impact. Whereas if you're working in a hospital, you know, you value care, you value knowledge that's going to make people better. You value your status in the field as a physician. You know, so we have distinct fields with distinct forms of capital. Doxa is our other meso level concept. This is the rules of the game. You know, and this is like the concept institution that I introduced earlier. You know, this is you know, the rules that determine what people can and cannot do, the resources they can access through their relations. You know, and this can be locally contested. You know, so in employment relations, you know, doxa in relation to who gets paid what can be contested, and that will affect access to resources. And finally, the micro level, he introduces this concept habitus, which he describes as a structuring structure or a feel for the game. This is basically within us. This is who we are. It's often tacit, you know. It's sort of like it's how we feel comfortable in any given domain because we understand that domain and how to act in it. It's our feel for the game, but it can also be strategic. You know, it's our orientation to playing the game within a given context. We can, in that sense, challenge the rules. And changing doxa can be a strategic orientation of the agent. It relates to deportments, manners, styles. It includes reflexive struggles for what is at stake within the game to contest the world. And it also includes illusio, which describes our sense of investment in the game. I try hard to publish in good journals. You know, I see that as my own illusio. I think automatically you can see an affinity between realism and realist social theory and Bourdieu, but precisely because you have a hierarchy of concepts. It's sort of like built from the ground up. You know, and so yeah, that for that reason, I think it's worth working with. However, if you read Bourdieusian scholarship, now I've not read it all, but I've read, you know, I've read good chunks of an outline of the theory of practice, and I've read Bourdieu and Wacombe, their invitation to relational sociology. I've got other Bourdieusian books that are on my shelves gathering dust, but you know, I've read some readers. And what Bourdieu doesn't do, at least where I've found it, is give you a way to unpack your meso level. He gives you a set of concepts and he leaves you to go away and determine what that means for the setting that you're actually studying. But yet, you know, he leaves cultural capital and social capital as extremely heterogeneous concepts. They emerge from, in particular, you know, culture and social capital. They emerge from ontologically various things. Cultural capital, for example, it's embodied. You know, it's our borrowing another concept, human capital. There's also informational capital. You know, but it's also instituted. So an organization like a university has cultural capital that inheres in the relations within the field. And so it's organized. And so its conditional possibility rests on the existence of organizations as well as individuals within the organization. So that these concepts are in themselves ontologically structured in a way that's actually, you start using realist concepts quite quickly when you're seeking to unpack them. And so, you know, when you unpick and explore this social stuff that's constituted of the Bourdieusian lexicon, what you find is critical realist concepts can actually help a lot. But when you read Bourdieusian scholars' work, they often just gloss over the field as an independent analytical category. So for our own paper, we looked at the field of entrepreneurship research, and there's a lot of papers that draw on Bourdieu. You know, they use, you know, concepts, you know, like entrepreneurial capital, which is basically assimilation of the other forms of Bourdieusian capital that are necessary to succeed. We failed to find one paper that used more than a paragraph to reflect on fields as causal things, you know, and that's woeful, we thought. And in part, this goes back to Archer's critique of Bourdieu, that he's guilty of central conflation. You know, in particular, the idea of habitus, you know, structuring structure, that we do things out of habit and that we reproduce social relations often without questioning them. You know, it reduces the emergence of social agency to a property of, well, social organization to a property of agency, without the field as being a strong conditioning force. And so, for example, de Klerk and Voronov assert identities and external environment, yet jointly and simultaneously co-created. This is simply at odds with realism. And I actually really encourage Bourdieusian scholars to move away from this sort of reductionism. But we also argue that central conflation is not a necessarily inevitable part of using Bourdieusian concepts. And so it can be corrected or assimilated to a realist lexicon. And this is basically what we do. In terms of macro, meso, and micro, this is how the Bourdieusian concepts fit together. The macro is the field of power. The meso is the forms of capital that inhere within that field. And then habits are orientated towards a reproduction of the field, but they can also contest doxa. They can contest the rules of the game. And if they are contesting the rules of the game, they're necessarily acting reflexivity with reflexivity. And so they can transform the field of power and therefore the forms of capital that inhere within it. And this is the realist lexicon alongside it. We still have agency at the bottom. We still have something like the field at the top. I often use the concept field in my writing now. I'm happy with that. But we can then think about how forms of capital inhere within organizations, within mechanisms, within and through the institutions that reproduce and transform or affect the emergence of mechanisms and organizations, and the role of the social agent in determining which institutions are applied or making the institutions actually happen. You can see by the way I'm speaking here that I see these lexicons as essentially you can slip between them without really trying too hard, precisely because the causal power of organizations is better understood if we take account of the types of capital that inhere within it. Okay, so what we did, and I realise I've only got 5 minutes left to speak, is we combine Bourdieusian and realist concepts to understand the networking of HR consultants. And we interviewed a load of consultants in a particular conurbation, and we asked them about where they networked, what they did in particular networking events, who they spoke to, where and when, and what was done in particular places and why. And what we found is that they went to different places at different types of day. And so there was often a morning meeting, and morning meetings typically discuss business generation and access to new opportunities. And then there's the lunchtime meetings. These were all often much more informal. They'd be within a clique and they'd talk about particular contracts that they were working on. They'd share resources in an informal way. And then in the end of the day, there was often another meeting that sort of involved know-how. It was the professional body meeting or a HR directors forum. And so at different times of day, they access different types of resources. And lo and behold, it was typically white men without families who found it most easy to access these different opportunities for networking. And it was those that had to look after other people with care and responsibilities that struggled to make their lives meet with the stringencies of the particular temporal structures of the events, which meant that they couldn't access resources in the same way, and they came to rely on the middle of the day events, the informal ones, which were useful, but they weren't necessarily powerful in terms of developing resources. And so we demonstrate that the values of the setting, what was done, varied depending on what resources were available, and we combine realist social theory and Bourdieu to taxonomize consultants' networking. I'm not going to dig around in this too hard, but it just demonstrates how we combine realism and Bourdieusian concepts within our study. You might want to pick out a line and take a look. But in the first column, field elements, is very much realist in its orientation. So we talk about mechanisms, organizations, formal, informal organizations, relational mechanisms, contractual mechanisms. We then describe the different subcategories within these. So these are how they were empirically manifest. Next column, these are the forms of capital that were transmuted and transformed and obtained or exchanged within these field elements. I'm not going to unpack them. Then the next column, we're sort of like using institution and doxa. So we're sort of like using realism and Bourdieu, and that there are these concepts that seem to be synonymous. And these are the institutions doxa associated with the different field elements. And finally, the emergent reflexive struggles, what agents were worrying about in the particular forums. Again, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, just pick into it a little bit, and you can see that, you know, we can, I hope, use combinations of Bourdieu and realism when we're trying to taxonomize both the social structure and agents' engagement with the social structure, both in terms of their institutions and in terms of their reflexive struggles. Okay, you know, that's basically the end of the talk. Here are some other examples. You know, Ismail Al-Amoudi, he's reread Foucault using realist ontology. Andy Brown, Steve Fleetwood, and John Roberts looked at critical realism and Marxism some time ago. Dave has looked at the reality of social construction. Fairclough, discourse analysis. I really like the work of Angela Martinez-Dye. I think she's a rising star of critical realism. She's done some really good work looking at intersectional theory from the point of view of a realist ontology. And then you've got John Mingers and his work on systems thinking, or Pilgrim and his work on psychologists. Or psychology rather. So I'm just demonstrating there that actually, you know, there's a lot of work going on where people have struggled within the realist lexicon to think about the relationship between realism and other branches of social theory. Okay, so in terms of our final thoughts, I found combining realism, social theory and Bourdieu really useful. And I think it creates a sophisticated and resource-form perspective for understanding the causal properties of social structures, as well as actors' engagement with them. Clearly, others use critical realist ontology and realist social theory in different ways, depending on their point of interest, what they're trying to explain. And so, you know, finally, what are your questions? Perhaps you can tell us about how you're trying to incorporate domain-specific ideas into a realist-informed studies. Okay.
Thank you.
There's the references. I'm putting them on there so people have access to them should they desire them.
Thank you, Steve. Wow, what a rich session, and so much to unpack there. We have already 2 questions in the Q&A. One, it's Priya. She's asking if you could explain a bit further central conflation. It's very intriguing and would be great if you could explain it a bit further, as it seems to follow the same argument as in epistemic fallacy, reducing the world to the statements about the world.
Yes, it is in many ways. You know, so central conflation, you know, Archer leveled the criticism particularly at Giddens and structuration theory and Bourdieu. You know, the idea that you know, everything is emergent from social agency as immediately positioned, and it sort of levels everything more on the side of free will. You know, you have the sort of like you know, argument that goes back to the ancient Greeks between free will and determinism. You know, and you know, the idea that people can create and emerge the world as it emerges, and as a consequence, it emerges from the discourses people use to construct the world and understand the world. You know, and how they understand the possibilities of the setting as well. You know, people have. I've never Giddens is up there on my shelf as well. It's another book I have but have never read. So I'm you know, but other people have told me that he isn't as guilty as central conflation as Archer protests. But yeah. You know, do you have anything to say, Caroline?
No, I don't have. I just have another question here of Ludmila. So if you finished this one, which I guess it's, yeah.
That's the best I'm going to do.
Yes, exactly. I think that's what I was thinking. So Ludmila is wondering about the realist rereading of the concept of institution. And she's mostly interested in the cultural cognitive institutional dimension following Colin Hay 2015. Where does this dimension go in your lexicon? Habitus, field, doxa? And also, if as a researcher explore only this dimension in my PhD, I'm still a critical realist, she asks. I think she's questioning her own position, or a constructivist only.
Yeah, well, my reading of American institutionalism is basically pragmatist. You know, and if Steve Fleetwood was in the room, he'd argue much more eloquently than me that that ends up ultimately becoming a social constructionist position. You know, because you know, everything becomes conditioned by the possibility of emergence to affect events within a particular setting in a pragmatic way. You know, and so it's all about transforming the ideas we use to act in the world, rather than giving any determinative role for the structures that precondition the context. So in relation to the cultural cognitive institutional dimension, I'd very much put that within habitus, and I would, you know, you see, this is this is an area which, you know, a lot of us struggle with, and I'm not going to pretend I've squared this particular circle. You know, Dave writes some good stuff in his book on the causal power of social structure, where he starts to talk about you know, sort of like the emergence of agency from the biological even, you know, but understanding what is habit and what is reflexive, and understanding where the boundary between the reflexive and the habitual actually exists. You know, because we're all habituated to language at the end of the day. You know, and because of that possibility, you know, even our sense of understanding of the world is pre-affected by the way in which we are socialized. Yeah. You know, and so our form of reflexivity is in itself, in a part, conditioned by our histories and experiences. You know, and so this is always a shaky area. You know, and I'm not going to magic a rabbit out of a hat and say, well, this is what the answer is. You know, I think it depends on the particular thing you're interested in. You know, because that, you know, if you're a sports scientist and interested in the performance of a particular type of athlete who's making decisions in a game, you know, you've got very set parameters about, you know, what are the reflexive parts of that practice and what are the automated parts of that practice, but whether that easily translates into and how that would translate into another domain, you know, trying to understand the business acumen of an executive making a decision about an investment, for example. You know, some of that is habitus. It's, you know, it's their feel for what's right, but some of it is their access to information. You know, and you know, so it's really difficult to give a static answer to that one. But yeah, that's an area we all struggle with, and you know, please go ahead and struggle with it with me.
Yeah, it's all very contextual as well, as you just said. It depends on what you're studying, what's the area, what is your interest, your question. Yeah, is there any others one? Yeah, sorry, again, let me go. New questions arising in the Q&A. Sorry, I have missed, Ludmila again saying, I've missed this part. Am I still a critical realist if I study only this dimension as a structure and culture which pre-exists agency?
Well, I'm not. It sounds to me like you're interested in psychology, you know, and how we are constituted, you know, of is structure within us. You know, I'd argue not. I have sympathies for Bourdieu when he talks about you know, our tendency to reproduce the world on the basis of habits, and that notion of a structuring structure, but that's within us. The realist idea of structure is external to us, you know, and so if yeah, so I'd make that categorical distinction between that which is within us as social agents, and that which may affect the manner of our reflexivity, and the structures that exist in the world external to us that can impinge on what we do without us even knowing about it. You know, people at the point of production often don't understand how financial and regulatory governance systems are actually screwing them. But nonetheless, they are being systematically screwed by financially regulatory and governance systems. You know, and so that's a distinction that realists make. So if you want to use the term structure within your narrative, if you want to call yourself a critical realist, you've got to recognize that there can be structures within our minds, but these are different ontologically from the structures that exist within the world external to us as agents. Yeah. That might help. I don't know.
Yes, I think that's a great answer, and it's also about your positionality. I think making that clear and reflecting about it. You know, when you're right, I think it's a good exercise. Yes, it's always shaky terrain. I would say there's nothing so definitive as, you know, black or white. I hope, Ludmila, that helps. And we're going to Joe Greener's question. In the pursuit of structural nuance, I guess, and complexity, does this kind of framework, for example, the HRM framework, for instance, lose sight of the need to give primacy to particular entities, sets of mechanisms, surplus value, for example?
I like that. It reminded me of a really good paper written by a guy called Dave Spencer in 2001, and he was making the case that our knowledge is necessarily political. You know, and if we're realists, we need to realize that. You know, and so when we are studying the point of production, for example, foregrounding things like surplus value appropriation is actually important political part of what we do, because you're then foregrounding concepts such as relative exploitation, you know, which can make a difference in debates about where and how investments are made. And so you have to remember here that actually the underlying logic of critical realism is a form of humanism. Actually, it's been described as Marxist humanism, in which actually you're seeking social formations that enable more human flourishing. And so actually, if you politicize what you study in terms of that narrative, you're actually automatically looking to describe the causal structures that result in relative privations and compare those and demonstrate others that actually result in relative emancipation. And so when our knowledge becomes sort of embedded in relation to a form of humanism, that's sort of where you start concentrating on the particular concepts like surplus value, and that then tends towards the illumination of certain mechanisms in relation to circuits of capital, financial circuits of capital, and how these tend to suck resources out of the system to the detriment of your average Uber driver, for example.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Dave has a question that he can't post in the Q&A, but I'm reading it. So great presentation. Could you say a bit more about Bourdieu's concept of field and whether it overlaps with critical realist concept of structure?
Okay. I view them as, I prefer field as a macro concept to social structure. And I like the term subfield as well. So an organization is a subfield, and if its organization is a charity trying to place people into jobs that might not otherwise have jobs, they're a field operating in a particular sector. They're a subfield operating in a particular sector that also happens to be an organization. And fields contain mechanisms that join their parts together, and that will be what makes them fields, as distinct from other fields. And so there are relations between universities associated with the quality of exam scripts, in the examination of texts, that are an inter-organizational set of mechanisms that exist between the organizations that constitute that field. And so yeah, I think the concept of field is broader. The concept of social structure is more specific, and it's a more applied concept. I think the concept's social structure then helps us describe elements of fields and mechanisms, therefore the parts of organizations, the connections between organizations. And so that's how I connect them together. And again, this idea that resources are important to understand the causal powers of organizations as entities, and that the Bourdieusian framework can help us there as well.
Great, thank you, Steve. There are no questions in the Q&A. I think we have done a good job answering them all. Is there any other question that anyone would like to ask? Anything more to discuss from the audience? Thank you, Steve. Such a great, really rich presentation.
Well, thanks for the invite. I've enjoyed this morning. This is the second time I did it. Last night, the first time I did it, it didn't go so well. So this is the one that I think we should be putting up on the YouTube site.
So I was yesterday. It was great, Steve. It was great as well.